There we go. I think I'm ready to kick off now. Right, good morning everyone, and welcome to this webinar. The focus of the webinar is to provide additional information for potential applicants on our funding competition to improve access and participation for Black, Asian and minority ethnic groups in postgraduate research study. This is a joint initiative funded by the Office for Students and Research England. My name is Estelle Kane. I'm a senior officer at the Office for Students and the co-lead on this project with my colleague Jonathan Petrowski from Research England. Over to you, Jonathan.
Thanks, Estelle. Yes, I'm Jonathan, as Estelle introduced. In this opening session, I'm just going to have a quick look at the agenda and then a welcome and housekeeping. Today we'll be going through about this webinar, how it works, the question and answers and that kind of thing in a housekeeping session. And then we'll have a bit of background from colleagues Stephen Hill and Amy Norton. And then we'll get into the funding competition overview, which I guess is the main body of the webinar. And in that we'll be looking in some detail at the bidding guidance and the bidding template, and Estelle and I will deliver that. And then you'll be pleased to hear we have a break at 11:50 to 12, and we'll come back for a Q&A session from 12 to 12:30 when our colleague Matt Jennings from the OFS will join us. Also, I'd like to say a big thank you to Rebecca and Nazra, who are working really hard behind the scenes to deliver this webinar and managing the Q&A. So yeah, welcome to the webinar. Thanks for joining. It's really delighted to see so many people here. We're really excited about this funding call, so that's absolutely brilliant. Just to let you know that the webinar is being recorded, and you probably heard that from the lovely Zoom voice at the start. But the recording will be of us, it's not of you. So if you're worried about that kind of thing, then don't worry, you won't be recorded in this session. And we hope to post the recording online on the competition web pages as sort of an ongoing resource. That's the intention. So there will be Q&A, and hopefully you would have seen that we asked you to pose your questions in advance of the webinar. And we've really worked hard to work the questions that you've submitted to us to influence the information that we provide throughout the webinar. But we'll also seek to address some of them in the Q&A session later. There is a live Q&A function for all of you, which you should be able to see at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I encourage you to use this throughout the webinar as we progress, as we will collate these as we go and seek to address them at the end in the Q&A session. There's an upvote function, which is essentially like a Facebook like, I think, and that's a really good way for us to understand, which questions are most commonly held and the ones that we should try and seek to address. So if there are any questions that we can't answer during the webinar, or if we run out of time, we'll try and find a way to think about how we can answer those questions. We might struggle to answer questions about specific projects or approaches. I think that might be a bit tricky in this sort of context, but if you do have questions of that nature, or you feel as though we haven't addressed your questions, then you can get in contact with us via the competition email address, and we'll be more than happy to have a discussion with you, and that's available with the competition documentation on the OFS website. There is a break, as I said, 10 minutes, 11:50 to 12. Okay, so now I'm just going to introduce Stephen Hill, who is the Director of Research at Research England.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you to Jonathan and Estelle for the introductory comments, and welcome to this webinar from me. It's a real pleasure to be on this webinar this morning and to be pushing this work forward. Could I have the first slide, please? So, as you'll know, we launched this funding competition on the 22nd of October to this year. It was a real kind of delight and relief, I have to say, for us to finally launch this work that we've been intending to launch in March 2020 and regrettably had to delay because of the COVID pandemic. But we now are able to launch and push this work forward, and that's really important to us. We're launching the call now at a time of great uncertainty and upheaval, in some ways as much uncertainty and upheaval as there was in March, but we think this is important work that we need to move forward. In the intervening period between our original point of launch and today, obviously we've seen a very rapidly and changing context for the work. Following the tragic events in the US and the Black Lives Matter demonstrations, there's been an even more increased focus on racial inequality and how we should tackle individual and institutional racism where it's present in our culture, systems and structures. And similarly, the COVID-19 pandemic has changed all of our lives. We would perhaps be meeting face to face today if it weren't for that. And has really highlighted the impact of complex systemic social inequalities linked to ethnicity upon different groups. So this is a new and even more urgent context into which we launch this call, even in the context of current pressures on the sector. But we do think there's an urgent need for the activities that will be supported through this funding. And jointly with the Office for Students, we're excited about the bids that we're going to receive and the innovation that we will no doubt get from you all in terms of tackling this important question. This is a joint competition organised jointly by the Office for Students and Research England, which is part of UK Research and Innovation. And this is a manifestation of something that was clearly set out in the Higher Education and Research Act, where it was envisaged that the Research England and the Office for Students, who of course were both born from HEFCE, a Higher Education Funding Council for England, which was dissolved by that act, it was envisaged that they would work jointly where it was more efficient for them to do so and allowed two organisations to more effectively exercise their functions. And this call is part of that joint work. And in 2018, we decided in the context of that legislative background to focus our joint working on issues of equality and diversity inclusion and on postgraduate research students. Can I have the next slide, please? This kind of schematic is a very simplified representation of how we see the division of the Office for Students' interests and Research England's interests in this project. The schematic is very simplified. The reality of the routes into and from higher education are far more complex and varied, and there certainly isn't the single pipeline that is implied by the diagram, that people move in and out of higher education at different stages. But we think the diagram is helpful in just illustrating that the Office for Students has interests in undergraduate study, in postgraduate taught study, and in postgraduate research study, whereas the Research England, our interests are in postgraduate research study and in progression from postgraduate research students into research careers. And that central area where is our shared interest, but we think within this scheme, we are interested in the whole spectrum of activities. And the assessment criteria for the funding competition, we're encouraged bidders to think about the transitions that are depicted here, and we want to seek a full range of projects that consider this life cycle in different ways. And you'll be hearing more about that in the later parts of the webinar. In developing the competition, we have taken a number of steps, and this has been a lengthy process. So I think getting us to this point, it's important to acknowledge that we haven't just kind of rushed into this. We have thought through the evidence. We started back in 2018 with a workshop looking at key ED&I challenges faced by the postgraduate population, and a number of topics for further exploration arose out of that. Questions around access and participation, mental health of postgraduate students, and bullying and harassment in the academic context. And there is actually work across Office for Students, Research England, and elsewhere in UKRI addressing all of these challenging issues. In 2019, we undertook a desktop review of the evidence in some of these areas. That desk review is summarised in the supporting information of the programme guide for this call. And out of that developed the idea that we wanted to work with in the area of access and participation for Black, Asian and minority groups in postgraduate research study. And to further inform our understanding of that, we organised a workshop around this time last year that some of you may have been involved in, where we really explored those issues in depth, and the findings from that workshop helped to both determine the need for a funding competition that we're holding at the moment, as well as informing the assessment criteria and the supporting information. As I said previously, we had intended to move from that workshop at the end of 2019 to a launch in March, but did decide to delay that because of the pressures created by the pandemic and associated lockdown. One of the key features in our approach to this question has been to try and develop the fund and its ideas in a collaborative and inclusive way. And I think, really central to this is that we need to, we have and we need to continue to engage with those who have lived and learned experience relative to the competition. And that we took through the research work that we did and also through the workshop. And we're very keen that philosophy that we need to engage in that way and be inclusive in the way we shape the agenda continues to run through into the competition itself. So our aim and hope is for strong engagement with Black, Asian and minority ethnic groups as a fundamental aspect of the programme. We're requiring you as bidders to do that as part of the development and the delivery of the funded projects. And we intend to continue to do that ourselves in making recommendations and decisions that build on the work that will come out of this programme, and also in the evaluation, which we intend to do at both programme and project level. So this is a very exciting programme. We think it's a really important agenda that needs real attention and endeavour to move forward. And we're really looking forward to working with you all as a community to drive that project forward, or those projects forward. So that's all I wanted to say to you this morning. Thank you very much again for attending and your interest in the competition. And I'll hand over now to Amy Norton from the Office for Students, who will give their perspective.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Stephen. So I'm Amy Norton. Good morning, everyone. And let me add my welcome to this morning's webinar on behalf of the Office for Students. It's been so encouraging to see such a huge volume of interest, that we've got over 260 people with us this morning, and no doubt more will be accessing this afterwards, accessing the recording afterwards. That we really are so excited to be launching this competition, to be part of this partnership with Research England, and we are very grateful for your time with us this morning. So if I'd like to have the next slide, please, that would be great. Thank you. So I always like to situate whatever we do at the OFS within our mission and objectives. And our mission is that every student, whatever their background, has a fulfilling experience of higher education that enriches their lives and careers. Personally, I love how inclusive this mission statement is, and I would draw your attention to the relevant area for today, was that it includes all students, undergraduates, postgraduates, past, present, future, home, international, and of course, that includes postgraduate research students. So we've already worked, as Stephen has mentioned, with Research England on postgraduate research mental health, as well as programmes around knowledge exchange and student engagement. And postgraduate research students were a focus of one of our special coronavirus briefing notes that we put out in the spring and the summer. Just to draw your attention, so the objectives that are labelled 1 to 4 are our regulatory objectives. That's what our regulatory framework is organised around. And these follow the student life cycle. And you'll see that these are embedded throughout the competition programme guidance and specifically addressed in our assessment criteria. And we'll be talking more about that later. Next slide, please. So what is the OFS planning to achieve and what is our goal? Well, it's to eliminate inequality in higher education within a generation. And I'm going to pause there to really highlight sort of how huge that goal is and how ambitious it is. And it's all within the next 25 years. It is worth highlighting here that the OFS, we have a number of tools at our disposal. So it's not just, we haven't just put that goal out there and we're expecting providers to all rush around and do it. We've got some tools which apply both pressure to individual providers and then some which support and drive continuous improvement and spread that effective practice in the sector. These together work in tandem to improve equality of opportunity. Our main regulatory tool for access and participation is through the access and participation plans that providers are required to submit to us and have approved as part of the OFS registration process. These focus on undergraduates because that's what the access and participation regulations focus on, but they do support routes to postgraduate study as a progression point. A&P plans provide an analysis of providers' current access and participation gaps with a very clear plan, including targets and measures about how these gaps will be addressed over the next 5 years. They're in a 5-year horizon. I'm not sure how many of you, and as I don't know quite what the participant mix is today, but some of you may have been engaged in your provider's access and participation plan. But either way, there'll be a valuable reference for any potential project within this competition. You can access all the plans through our website. So our main supportive tools include funding, such as this competition, promoting effective practice that supports the sector, and we've got an A to Z of effective practice on our website, and we're also funding the Transforming Access and Student Outcomes Centre, which is a What Works centre funded for 3 years. And the final outcomes of these projects and this competition will feed into TASO as well. And we use evidence and evaluation to understand and show how higher education contributes to social justice and mobility. And I'll highlight how we've used this approach to inform this funding competition. Next slide, please. So as Stephen mentioned, we conducted an internal review to help us focus and understand all of the equality, diversity and inclusion challenges in PGR study. And this is summarised in the programme guidance. And this really clearly highlighted the issue of underrepresentation of Black, Asian and minority ethnic students in postgraduate research study. And we noted particularly, and we pay particular reference and tribute to the work of Leading Roots in their Broken Pipeline report, which highlighted in particular the disparity in awarding rates of Research Council studentships and other forms of postgraduate research funding. Advanced HE student statistics reports, which highlighted the differences across disciplines and by ethnicity, which is very useful. The work of the UK CGE's working group on Black, Asian and minority ethnic participation in PGR, their first edition thematic bibliography, and Professor Paul Wakeling's review of PGR admissions for RC UK. We also acknowledged the OFS's current work and key performance measures, including the degree outcome gap between Black and white students, and our addressing barriers to student success projects and our annual equality, diversity and inclusion statistics. So taken all together, we've been able to really rigorously analyse the gaps which do exist for this group of students, for these groups of students at postgraduate research level. So the details and references to all of these highlights that I've mentioned are available in the programme guidance. Next slide, please. So we conducted further work to really understand more fully how we could improve access and participation for Black, Asian and minority ethnic students in postgraduate research. Our workshop that we held in December that Stephen mentioned used the issues tree methodology to unpack some of the highlighted barriers. From this, it became clear that the key issues were impact of prior attainment in undergraduate study and access to PGR. And we really saw that in terms of the ability of students to move between perhaps more lower entry tariff providers and higher entry tariff providers, where quite a lot of PGR research opportunities are concentrated. We noted the inconsistency in the PGR admissions processes, difference between subjects, pathways and opportunities for PGR students, and the importance of a supportive and inclusive environment to successful PGR participation and completion. I think we hypothesized around the first three from reading the literature. I think the fourth one really came through very strongly when we were really speaking to people and exploring all the different issues that might be connected to this. So the notes from this workshop are available on our website, and it should be clear to see how this is fed into our funding competition. So in response to our understanding that there is difference across the sector, we explored further the assumption that the majority of PGR study occurred in certain providers compared to others. We've published some ad hoc official statistics confirming this, showing that 2/3 of PGR study is concentrated at the highest tariff providers, and that there's been little change in the participation of Black, Asian and minority ethnic students in PGR at these types of providers over the last 8 years. This report is available on our website. And we've also had a lot of questions about the type of providers that might be eligible to participate in this programme, and I'm sure some of those will be picked up in the Q&A session today. But it's worth me saying here that please be assured that because we've published those statistics and we were interested in exploring that issue around types of providers, it doesn't mean that our competition is focused on those highest tariff providers. Rather, it acknowledges that provider type, especially at undergraduate level, is a potential factor in the underrepresentation at PGR level, and we actively welcome participation of all provider types in this funding competition. Obviously, we'll make sure during the assessment process and the assessment panel that there is a balance of provider types that will be considered when we're making our final recommendations. Next slide, please. So in closing, I just want to highlight that the evidence that we've examined, interrogated, published and presented demonstrates a very clear need for action in this area. We have come together, we've worked for over 2 years to really design and publish a funding competition and really challenge the sector to facilitate change and really bring about change in this area. And we're so excited about the level of interest and just how innovative this programme has the opportunity to be. I will now hand over to Estelle and Jonathan, who, by the way, have been the absolute driving forces behind this competition and a real demonstration of amazing partnership working between OFS and Research England. So I'm so grateful to them for all their hard work on this. And then there will be 30 minutes at the end to discuss any questions that might have arisen throughout this presentation. I'm not going to close without highlighting the email address that you need to submit your finished bids to, and the all-important deadline, which is noon on the 28th of January 2021. And now I'm going to pass over to Estelle and Jonathan. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amy. And welcome everyone. Just saying hello again to some of you who may have just joined us. My name is Estelle Kane. I'm a senior officer at the Office for Students. I am very excited to be here talking about this today. I'm going to be going through, together with Jonathan, the funding competition documentation that we have. So we're structuring the webinar across the programme documentation. So hopefully that will provide a logic framework for us to go through. So next slide, please. And the next one, thank you. So first thing I wanted to highlight for everyone was the deadline, which is noon on the 28th of January 2021. We have had a few questions about the timetable, so I was just going to put this up front and centre. So we're hoping to assess over between February and April, with early, hopefully, recommendations of award over April, with start either April or May 2021. Thank you. So an obvious point to start was the overall aim of this programme. So our aim is to improve access and participation for Black, Asian, minority ethnic groups in postgraduate research study. I'm just going to break this down a little bit in terms of what do we mean by those very different elements. So firstly, with access and participation, as Amy and Stephen have just summarised, this is really around the student life cycle in terms of access into, experience, whilst and progress out of postgraduate research study. By Black, Asian and minority ethnic groups, so we obviously acknowledge that this is a very generalised grouping of very different ethnicity categories, and we invite projects to reflect on the very specific groups that face inequalities in their own project context. HESA, Advanced HE, our own EDI statistics, and the recently published UK CGE data centre provides a useful resource to be able to kind of do an analysis for your particular issues in your particular provider or group of providers. By postgraduate research study, we're referring to students that are on research-based programs. So this can be MRes, MPhil, DPhils, doctorates. And we're using those on level 7 and 8 in the qualifications framework. This is referenced in the program guidance. Next slide, please. Thank you. This is just to give you a highlight of the kind of scale that we're looking at. So we have £8 million available for this programme. The funding programme itself is of 4 years. So we are looking to fund projects for up to 4 years duration. Just to highlight here, because we had some questions around it, bids will not be scored on the duration, so they won't be scored whether it won't be a disadvantage to have shorter duration projects. In terms of the number of projects that we're going to receive, we're not quite sure, or that we'll be able to fund, but this would be basically depend on those that are submitted and those that are recommended for funding. But what I can say is that there'll be a minimum of £200,000 per project, which can be up to £400,000 for projects within a single institution or single provider, and then a maximum of £800,000 for projects with multiple institutions and multiple providers. Again, no preference is going to be given to whether it's a single or multiple provider application. Funding is revenue only, which is normal for our funding competitions, and we're expecting our funding within these projects to sit alongside existing investments. So we'll talk a bit more later about what we mean by that. But we have had, just to address here, a few questions around the funding and what we've around the funding and the funding models. And what we're saying to this is that actually we haven't set a funding model, as we're expecting each project to be different in terms of their range of activities and their own cost base. So it is possible to use the FEC if that is appropriate for your project. And we would normally expect the indirect costs to be covered by the institution as part of its co-investment and contribution to project costs. However, this may not be appropriate in all cases. And so you should describe the funding model in the bid and the key costs as per the template, which we'll go over a bit later. So it's quite structured in terms of how we're asking you to talk about your costings there. We're imagining, obviously, that the costing is going to be related to activities and the key activities and how these will be maintained and over the duration of the project. Salaries and other revenue funding can be included in the costs. However, we cannot fund capital costs. Thank you. Another high level and point and questions that we're receiving as well is around eligibility. So there's a couple of things to say here. Firstly is around eligibility to lead a bid, and so that does need to be an approved fee cap provider in the approved fee cap category of the OFS register. as of the 22nd of October 2020, so that's the date that the competition was launched, they need to be eligible for RE funding and as detailed in the RE's published terms and condition. This does mean that you do need to be a provider to be a lead applicant. So we've had a couple of questions about whether DTPs are eligible to lead. Unfortunately, they aren't as the DTP, but a provider is. In terms of the number of bids, so if you are a lead on one bid, you're able to be a lead on one bid and then a partner in up to 3. So if you're a lead, you can be a partner in up to 4 projects. If you're not a lead, you can be a partner in up to 3 projects. Third sector organisations are eligible to participate, and again, they are only eligible to participate in up to 3 bids. It is the responsibility of the leader provider to allocate and manage the partnership and allocate the funds appropriately. Other UK nations may be partners in the bids, but are not eligible to receive funding. We have had a couple of questions around this. Now, the reason for that is that the other nations, UK nations, have other funding sources for this investment. And the other question we've had is around the kind of activities, or how can you imagine other UK nations participating? And our response to that really is to say that they can participate in any capacity as long as it's clear in the project proposal how they're contributing and how it adds value to the project. So this could be in a couple of ways. We can imagine either supporting students from the other UK nations to participate in activities in England, or the provision of strategic advice of interventions that are known to work in other nations and how these can maybe be scaled up and transitioned to England. But just to reiterate, sorry, there's no funding for the other UK nations here. Thank you for that. I'll hand over to Jonathan.
Thanks, Estelle. So I'm going to talk a bit about partnership and co-investment, and this is something we have received a few questions about in advance of the webinar, and this relates to pages 6 and 7 of the bidding guidance. So overall, we are seeking commitment from all partners, regardless of their type, and that really we'd like to see ideally at an organisational level as well as at a project level. And we know that the project's role will depend upon their expertise and the project itself, and it will be different depending on the bids that you're putting forward. We have had a question about whether a partner could be involved in one aspect of the project alone, and this is fine. I think that's as long as it reflects the project needs and the partner's expertise. I think there was that question also asked a bit about how that should be costed, and I think that just really should relate directly to the costs incurred by that partner, if that makes sense. The key term is that we're looking for an appropriate level of co-investment, and we haven't determined a specific ratio, and we recognise that this will vary depending upon the partner in question and the specifics of financial circumstances. And co-investment we see as either cash investment or investment in kind, and we won't rate either of those higher than the other, equally valued. What we really want to see, and what will really help in your application and the assessment process, is the rationale for the level of co-investment, and that's really what you should focus on, and how this demonstrates the commitment of the lead applicant and all partners to the project, how it demonstrates future sustainability. So we'll talk about that a little bit more later, but thinking about how the aims of the project are extended beyond the life of the funding, and also risk sharing alongside Research England and OFS funding. So next slide, please. Yeah, so continuing around partnership and co-investment, as Stephen said earlier, we were intending to launch this funding call in March, but of course, due to the impact of the coronavirus, we couldn't. And we felt we needed to recognise the impact of COVID-19 upon co-investment in the competition. So work pressures due to the coronavirus pandemic have impacted levels of co-investment. We want to see that as part of the rationale that I mentioned in the previous slide. We accept that there is an impact, and I think it's legitimate for you to tell us about that impact and how that has determined your level of co-investment. You need to explain those limitations though, and it is about the coherence of the explanation that will be important. We must explain how the activities will be sustained beyond any funding period. So thinking about the lasting legacy of this investment, how this makes a change to a significant change to existing practice, which we talk about a little bit later, I think. And co-investment again is not necessarily cash. So I think we want that clear rationale. That's the main thing to take away around this kind of section, with the context of the project, around the disciplines, providers, provider types. You know that context is different for different institutions, and really that's what we want to see in the rationale. We recognise that there are risks and uncertainties in long-term planning, especially at the moment when you're thinking about sustaining activities, but we'd like to see consideration of those risks and how they might be mitigated. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so this next slide focuses upon the bid assessment process and relates to the bidding guidance, page 8. And I'm going to talk a little bit about our approach. So the bids will be assessed based upon the alignment with our priorities, which I think we talk about in the next slide, and the extent that they meet the assessment criteria. That's the primary ways that these bids will be assessed, along with a sort of coherence of the bid and the rationale and risks. We will be actively seeking to fund a diverse range of projects. So we will make our funding decisions to try and include a level of diversity in what we fund. And that will be types of providers. So as Amy said, we're not just focused on higher tariff providers. We will actively seek to fund across types of providers, across places. So we would like geographical kind of split in how we where we fund approaches. So we'd like to see diversity in the approaches taken by the funded projects. Discipline areas, we want to make sure that the funding covers across different discipline areas. And Black, Asian and minority ethnic groups. So again, recognizing that this isn't a homogenous group of people, and actually there are barriers specific to the different groups within that kind of broad categorization. We'll seek to fund projects that a range of projects that address barriers for different groups and stages of the life cycle. So I think it's been mentioned earlier, and I think we talk about it a bit more in the fund criteria, in the assessment criteria, but looking at routes into PGR and the barriers there, the experiences during PGR, and also routes from PGR into diverse range of careers. In terms of the more sort of process side of things, an internal OFS RE panel will review proposals. We'll have an external panel who will also review the proposals and make recommendations to us for funding. And there is a chance that the panel may call bidders for a virtual interview, but we may not equally. Okay, handing over to you, Estelle.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'm just going to talk a bit more about the priorities and the assessment criteria that Jonathan's just mentioned. So we've framed the overall programme around 3 strategic priorities that reflect those of Research England and OFS. So the strategic priorities are up there on the side. So we are looking for projects to have a strong narrative on how they align with one or more of these. Just to note, we're not making an assessment against them. It's just a framework for us to be able to situate your project. But effectively what we're looking at there really is around ensuring that projects are either stimulating innovation in effective practice, that they are ambitious in how they're addressing evidence issues of inequality, and building on effective collaboration within the sector. Thank you. Next slide, please. We have 10 assessment criteria, and we're just going to go through each of those now. The first one is around acknowledging the student life cycle, so the extent to which the bid considers one or more aspects of the student life cycle for Black, Asian, minority ethnic students, and the extent to the impact has beyond the life of the project. So we're looking at improving access, so entry into, experience whilst on PGR, and then progression from PGR. So this is not necessarily just focusing from progression into HE, we're also looking at progression into the broader economy as well. We have had a couple of questions around this criterion, and especially whether projects are required to address all aspects of the student life cycle. So what we're saying is that projects do not need to address all aspects of the student life cycle. You can focus on one or more. And the project will be assessed as a whole. So we've had a question about whether if you are addressing each different section, whether each of those gets assessed separately, but no, we're looking at the project as a whole. So there will be a narrative across all of those. Our second criteria really is a really important one, and as Stephen mentioned, is around the extent to which the proposal is founded on engagement with and advice from Black, Asian and minority ethnic students in the design, development and/or delivery of key activities where appropriate. We've had a few questions around this, especially in terms of how to ensure engagement in an ethical and in a meaningful way. And what we'd like to say here is that there is some existing practice around the sector to support this. So as Amy was mentioning, for those providers or with access and participation plans, there's likely to be expertise within your provider for people who have engaged with students in this way to support A&P. But also we have some resources available on our website, which includes various models of co-production and co-creation. So I'd highly recommend having a look through those. And we will put a link to that if we don't have already for you. Next slide, please. Thank you. The next three criterions, C, D and E, are related. Firstly, one, to the extent to which activities test new and innovative approaches or significantly extend or scale up from existing practice. The questions we've had around this are around really the scaling up side of things and wondering if there's a practice that's already existing, whether that can be funded or not. So in principle, what we're not funding are activities that are already in existence and that would be continuing and existing without this funding pocket programme. But what we are interested in, though, is if this practice can then be scaled up or trialled in a different manner, whether that's in different providers, whether the difference is that it's across a partnership, or whether the difference is that it's across different fields, or it's from different student groups. So the element there for existing activities is to look at the way that this fund would allow you to promote those activities in a different context. Criterion D is here around the extent to which the bid will contribute to better understanding of evidence and effective practice and how this could shape future policy and practice across the sector. So what we're looking for here within the project proposal is a really clear understanding of how, through the evaluation, dissemination plans and outreach and experiences from this project, and how these will inform others who are interested in addressing access and participation for Black, Asian and minority ethnic students in postgraduate research. Criterion E is around the importance. This is quite a long one. I'm not going to read that one out. So, but you can see it there. So this is around the importance of rigour and in the project design, development and implementation. Well, what I would like to say is that our Annex A, so the application form, has a really structured framework for addressing this criterion with really clear questions to address all the different elements of it. But the principle really is around ensuring rigorous project design and implementation and delivery. Thank you.
Thanks, Estelle. So just looking at, I think it's the last couple of criteria. So criteria F is very much focused on value for money. We do give 4 points around what that kind of narrative should look like for this criteria. The scale of deliverables and intended outcomes against the funding requested. So what is it, how ambitious almost is it that what is your project seeking to be, and how does that sit against the funding requested? The cost effectiveness of the approach, so how the funding requested is intended to be used and the activities it will support. An appropriate level of co-investment provided, and again that word appropriate, that is the key thing to take away with that particular point, and on all those sort of discussion had about that on the earlier slide, acknowledging that co-investment is both cash or investment in kind, and sustainability beyond the lifetime of the funded project. So again, I spoke a bit about sustainability in that earlier slide, and taking on board those kind of key points. Criterion G, the ambition and likelihood that the activities will secure a significant change into current practice. So I think that is it's sort of focusing on that strategic priority of ours around the ambition of the bids. Also, the bids are realistic, so the likelihood that they will be successful, and that the activities will secure a significant change in current practice. So we're not looking for more of the same, as kind of Estelle mentioned in the last slide, but really we want this funding to be used to leave a real change that continues beyond the lifetime of the funding. Thank you. Okay, so those are the assessment criteria, and those are the things that the bids will be assessed against. We do have some further requirements in the bidding guidance on page 9 to 10. So the funding may not be used to create individual PGR student positions. So we have received quite a few questions about this. What does this mean, and what does this exclude or include? I think we see this funding as sitting alongside existing investments. So there's substantial investment in the sector in studentships, and we think that we would like to see this funding sitting alongside that and seeping into those other investments in the sector. Things like tuition fees and living expenses we consider to be part of studentships and are not something that we're looking to fund with this project. And there's the desire for sustainability that's driven that approach. And also, if we're looking at establishing significant and sustained change in practice, then we feel like we will do that by working alongside existing investment and using this fund to create that kind of environment of change. B, funding may not be used to conduct exploratory research. So we had some question on this beyond applied evaluation. So we had big questions on this as well. What does that mean? And what's the distinction? I think that when we conducted our desktop review, we saw, as Amy said, that there has been persistent inequality over a sustained period of time. So I think if you look back at the last decade, it just hasn't shifted massively. So we think that there's enough evidence of inequality, and this funding call is more about taking action and making change. So I mean, there's always an argument for more research and better understanding of the issues, but that's not the aim of this fund. We want this fund to create change. And when we say applied evaluation, we mean that if learning and better understanding of the issues come about as part of the project and through evaluation, then that is acceptable and great, but we feel there's a distinction there. And C, support current or ongoing activities which will happen without the funding. So it's not more of the same. This is, if you have, I think Estelle spoke about it, if there are existing practices, we're not looking just to continue existing funding, but scaling up those activities and thinking about, you know, the next step with them. I think that would be a legitimate use. So thinking along those lines. And I've seen questions pop up around, is this a focus on UK domiciled students? Yes, it is, yeah, as defined by HESA. I think, you know, we've developed this call on the basis of evidence of inequality, and we can safely and confidently know that that exists for UK domiciled students, and as it's generally the basis of the statistics that we've been using. And actually on the international kind of picture, the story will be different for each nation, and it's not something that we've that has driven this funding call. So we're keeping this for UK. The focus of the call is on UK domiciled students. Okay. So in the bidding guidance, pages 10 to 11, we gave some additional guidance and recommendations, and these aren't assessment criteria, but they're just recommendations for you to look at the excellent resources that are out there, to consider the relevant literature and evidence base. So as Amy mentioned, the UKCG thematic bibliography, and I think they've published an interactive data set recently that might be a useful tool for that people looking to drill down into the HESA data and look at the makeup of the PGR population. The Leading Routes Broken Pipeline, which has been a real driver and asks really important questions. And the UKI EDI evidence reviews as well, which you find on the UKI website, and they focus on sort of the national and international EDI challenges. And there's plenty more out there, so don't be limited by that. We'd be really keen to hear from you about the relevant evidence and examples of effective practice, and these things that will guide your approach for your bids. We've had quite a few questions about what is it specifically that you will fund. You know, what are the specific examples, and we do have a list in our bidding guidance. I think it's probably pages 10 and 11, which is indicative. So we again, I don't want to be limiting the way that you're thinking about this project and the approaches that you may take, but we give an example. A good list of examples of a range of innovations and approaches, and they've derived from the workshop that we held at the that we held in 2019, I think, and where experts pointed us in the direction of sort of the barriers faced by the population and what approaches might be taken to address those barriers. Again, not exhaustive. And I would also say you should consider building on established activities used at undergraduate level. So the OFS has a good deal of information on that, particularly would flag TASO as a really good source of evidenced undergraduate interventions. Providers access and participation plans, and UniConnect, I think, are really good examples from undergraduate level as well. Okay, next slide. Over to you, Estelle.
Thank you. Thanks, Jonathan. So just building on what Jonathan was saying there, obviously, that the programme guidance also gives examples of specific challenges that might be addressed within the context of the project. And just to reiterate that these are not exhaustive, these are ones that we've just summarised, for example, and we really do encourage you to look for other areas and other evidence and use your own data that's within your provider, also within your specific field as well. I'm sure there are lots of resources in terms of understanding particular barriers and some innovative interventions that might be able to scale up or test just in a different environment. So this is just highlighting a couple really. One is around supporting and engaging current and future PGR students. So we're used to using that term in the OFS, current and future students. So that could be working with undergraduate courses and taught postgraduate students in terms of supporting transition into postgraduate research. And also want to really actively encourage looking at increasing access and progression through non-traditional routes. So those either coming into PGR and also where PGRs may progress to. So, and that can be just broader industry and not just higher education, as I've mentioned before. So projects can focus on one specific group or one specific barrier, but they can also look at other different elements as well. So just need to be clear in the narrative about why you focused on particular barriers, particular challenges. Thank you. Next slide, please. Thank you. This is on bidding guidance, page 12, just going through a little bit, highlighting assessment monitoring and how we will work once projects are funded. So the assessment process has been addressed, and I can see there's quite a few questions about that, and I think we will address those as well in the Q&A. But for the monitoring process, just to highlight that this will follow the kind of standard practice that we do with our funding competitions. So this will be likely an annual reporting monitoring process proportionate to the projects. And if we can, we will look at ways of meeting and maybe visiting projects depending on circumstances. I've always found this a very useful way to understand how a project itself is being implemented. And obviously a key part of what we're trying to do here, because this is a kind of basically trying to build a critical mass of expertise in A&P for postgraduate research students. So we're hoping that as part of this as well, that funded projects will be able to form a network, almost like a community of practice, in which we'll be able to regularly share and learn experiences through the project design and development and implementation. Obviously, a key part of this will be engaging with the external evaluators, and they will also really be heavily involved in our network, and we'll use that network as well to help us with the dissemination of project resources as and when. So we're hoping that that will be an iterative process as well. I have received a question about specifically what kind of outputs we're requiring at the end of the project. So as I was mentioned, there's the usual kind of monitoring reports that are expected under these kinds of grants. But we would add here really that actually it depends on the specific project, because the dissemination plan will be a part of the project proposal. And again, this will be in collaboration with the programme evaluators, which we are just in the process of awarding. Thank you. Next slide, please. So that was a quick, swift run through the programme guidance. So hopefully that's been a really helpful kind of introduction to what we're looking for at that level. We now want to have a go at going through in some detail Annex A, which is the bidding template. So we had a greatly phrased question come through, which was, what are the ingredients of a good proposal? I think that's a really nice way of phrasing that. And I think for a high level, from my perspective, when you're writing the proposal, always think of the assessors in mind in terms of how can I provide the information in a way that allows the assessor to make a full assessment based on all the available information that's in the bid. So what do we really want the assessors to know in terms of how we're framing the project and how we wish to deliver the project? An obvious clear element really is ensuring that all the assessment criteria are addressed, because this is what the assessors will be using to mark the scores. We do have some requirements around how you submit, and again this is really all about readability for the assessors to ensure that it's as standard as possible when it comes to the assessment process. So we have a template for you to complete in, which we're calling Annex A. That is a Word document. We ask that it's no more than 24 sides. We also ask that the format is no smaller than 11 point Arial. And we also ask that you use the text boxes and the tables within the bidding template to complete your form. Thank you.
Okay. So one of the things that we're asking for in Annex A is letters of support. So these are an important part of the process we consider. We want 2 letters from the lead provider, 1 from a director of finance confirming that the resources outlined have been approved, and 1 from the head of the lead provider, which should go into a few more issues, as well as that confirmation that the resource has been approved. So we want the letter from the head of provider to outline the strategic importance of this bid and of the funding, and to do that by referring to institutional strategies and how if funded, the activity coming from the bid aligns with those institutional strategies. We also want the head of the lead provider to talk about senior leadership commitment and the provision of a safe and supportive environment. And I think we've put these in here because these are kind of quite frequently cited facilitators when you're looking at kind of cultural change and organizational kind of level change, or basically are important in facilitating change. And I think we drew from UUK's publication, Closing the Gap, for these specific recommendations, but I note that they feature again in this week's publication from UUK, looking at tackling racial harassment. And in terms of senior leadership, really what we're looking for is commitment to the provision of senior leadership for the activities over the lifetime of the award, and in relation to that commitment to future sustainability that we've talked about in previous slides. I think this is an important thing to ensure that the projects are successful and to bring about real lasting change. And the note on a safe and supportive environment, I think that conversations in this area, they can be difficult, and they're really required to be held, facilitated and allowed within an organisation. I think it's not an easy thing, and I think it is something that requires proactive attention. So that's something we want commitment from the head of the lead provider. We also want letters from all partners involved in the bid. Oh, sorry, just to say that the letter from the head of the lead provider should talk about how those commitments will be delivered across the partnerships where that's applicable. But the letters from the partners should outline the partner contribution and should talk about any sort of conditions in investment. In terms of format, it'd be great if they could all be collated into a single PDF for us, because that, again, as an assessment, will make things a lot easier. We did receive a question about whether a DTP could be a lead provider. And I think Estelle mentioned that they could not. It needs to be a single provider as per our terms and conditions in the OFS register. But the question also asked whether a letter would be required from a DTP. And I think the answer to that is I think that's perfectly valid. It depends on the project makeup itself. I think that if the involvement of the DTP is substantial enough that they should be considered a partner, and there is a real impact on DTP activities, then yes, a letter of support would go some way to sort of assuring us that this activity is sort of wanted and fits well with the DTP. Okay. So sections 1 to 4, this is quite simple, really. That will spend a huge amount of time. Who is applying? So this is just really to allow us to communicate properly with the correct person about the bid, and for grant awarding for the successful projects. The project partner information provides us with understanding of the partners and their anticipated role and co-investment. So there's a section there where you'll be asked to sort of give a list of partners, and then this will give us a really good overview of the sort of makeup of your bid. And it also asks for whether co-investment is fully confirmed or available in principle, whether it's cash or in kind. So I think this table gives us a really nice overview of partners and co-investment. And then there's a section on financial details, which of course is an important part of the bid. I urge you to make sure that these are coherent and make sense and align with the rest of the narrative that you provide about the bid. So please take time to complete them, and it gives us a really clear overview of the project design and management. We want to understand that the costs requested, and Table 6 seeks a breakdown of those costs by project management, the different work streams, if there are multiple work streams in a bid, and evaluation. So there is you specify funds for the evaluation of the project. It's an important part of what we're seeking to do, and there is room for you to seek funding for that specific purpose. We are looking to understand both staff costs and non-staff. So you should set out the rationale for any staff costs and make sure which organisations are paying for the individual costs, and non-staff as well, including any indirect costs and overheads. And make sure, again, be clear which organisations are paying for the individual costs. That should go in the free text box where we want a rationale of those costs, and you can really explain to us why you are seeking the amount that you are seeking. And then there's a segment for looking at the profile of funding across quarterly statements, and this allows us. This should tie in with the way that you've planned your project. If your costs all come at the start of the year, this should kind of be reflected in the profile of funding across quarterly statements, and it should be a coherent sort of across that section and the plans that you give us. Okay, over to you, Estelle.
Thanks, Jonathan. I'm just going to go through now the remaining tables of the bidding templates, and this is really where it gets into the details of your project. So table 8 is a project overview. So again, if we're thinking of the assessors who are going to be reading your projects, what we're looking here is just a high level understanding of the project. So this looks at the overall understanding of the project, and understanding of who's participating in the project, so a track record of those who are involved, strategic vision of the project, and also the rationale and the evidence that's been used to frame the project. In terms of table 9, this is addressing the bid criteria. So obviously this is the bit where it actually gets scored, although all the other information is really helpful for the overall understanding. And I say all the criteria, but actually 2 of the criteria are not included in this table. And this is because criterion E is effectively considered in the evaluation plan for the next 2 tables. And then criterion F, because that relates to the financial side of things, that's in the tables that Jonathan has just mentioned. So what we're really asking for here is a lovely description of how your project meets the assessment criteria that we have gone into quite a lot of detail from in a bit earlier. Thank you. So project 10, so project table 10, sorry, I'm just reading my slides too quickly, is looking at project activity. So this is one way of conceptualizing this, is thinking of this as the kind of theory of change. And so this structure allows you to break down the project activity to understand what the activity type is, what resources are being used to support this activity, and what the expectations are of this activity on improving access and participation for Black, Asian and minority ethnic students in postgraduate research. They will align with the financial information, obviously, and ideally what we're finding is some metrics related to the activities as a way of establishing the baseline, but also measuring over time. So the expectation obviously is that there will be some change over time, and acknowledging that it can be up to a 4-year program, and that changes will happen at different rates within that, but it's just as long as it's really clear from us about the expectations based on all the evidence in your project about why these activities will have the impact and the kind of impact that we imagine that they will have. So sounds like a very obvious point, but we obviously, when an assessor is looking at this element, they need to be able to understand that it's credible and that it's realistic. So again, this is all very based in the evidence that you'll have outlined and in relation to all the financial project side of things, which is a really useful way of understanding your project as well. If I have the next slide, please. Right, so the evaluation plan. So this is a big part of your application. So what we have done is, and this is addressing criterion in E, is that we have provided a framework for the evaluation program. So with the aim of this facilitating your ability to provide and summarize the approach to your evaluation, how the evaluation will assess the impact of your project, how it will be delivered, and also how you and others are going to learn from the evaluation as the project progresses. The previous table 10, I think, well, like I said, is basically your kind of theory of change. So that will inform this part of your proposal as well. But I imagine actually when you're drafting this that you will be working together with the process of your understanding the theory of change. There are some really helpful resources for addressing this. This is the first time that you've had to tackle evaluation in this way. So we recommend the Better Evaluation Project and the NPC website, but also I'd recommend our website, the OFS website, as we have some resources to supporting evaluation, but at the moment that's mainly within the context of access and participation plans. But as we've kind of been indicating throughout, reviewing their work at undergraduate level, the interventions and maybe the way your provider, your institution has approached that might be a way to consider the approach to this at postgraduate level. Well, add that we've had quite a few questions around the evaluation, which I called, this was before the webinar. There may be some coming up now, but I'm just going to focus on the ones from before the webinar. One is around, are we interested in whether for something that doesn't work as much as we're interested in something that does work. And our response to that is that obviously we're interested in anything that contributes to the evidence base. So if, for example, there is an intervention throughout the project that hasn't worked, that is really useful evidence for the sector. And what we mean though, it's useful in the sense as long as we know that it's a conclusion that has been made following a rigorous project design, implementation and evaluation process. And as we've outlined in the guidance and in the annex template, we are commissioning an independent evaluation of the programme, and we are in the process of reviewing those at the moment, and we're hoping that they will be up already in place before just around the time of contract awards. So we're anticipating that projects will work with the national level evaluation. And so it is possible at that point that the evaluators will be, well, no, it's not possible. They will be supporting you at project level in terms of your local evaluation plans as well. So it might be, as the process moves on, that some amendments need to be made to evaluation plans, but this will be done with the support of the evaluators. So just to add some reassurance there. We've had a question about the relationship between the the project evaluation plan and the overall programme evaluation plan. So all we can say about that at the moment is that what I've just said, because this depends on the variety of things, least of all the projects that we receive and that are funded, as well as the supplier and their preferred methodology as well. So there's a couple of unknown factors in terms of exactly how that will work, but it will work within the framework of the RE and OFS collaboration. So I just wanted to highlight that the support will be there for you through that. We've had another interesting evaluation question around how will outcomes be measured. So we're assuming this is outcomes at the project level. And as I could understand actually that this can be quite an overwhelming point to consider, especially given the focus of the project. And I think what we want to really emphasize is that you, well, because it's project based, this will be based on the project itself. So in terms of what you're trying to achieve specifically. So using your table 10 as a way of analyzing and really getting down to the detail of activities and their anticipated impact on improving access and participation. So whilst we can't specify right now for you what your outcomes will be because it is related to the project, what we would like to say again, like I said, is just to give you reassurance that it will be within the overall evaluation methodology. And also this is likely to evolve over the project, and it's something that we are likely to share as the network of projects too. Right, I think I'm just going to finish there. Have the next slide, please. It was just a big thank you. So I'd like to thank you all for listening, and I'd also like to thank you for your questions, which, as Jonathan mentioned at the beginning, we're not able to answer in real time, but we will give you a break now of 10 minutes, and then we'll come back after our break to address as many of those questions as we can. Thank you.